So, I'm covering Genesis 7 today, and Lord willing, all the way to Genesis 8, verse 19, the end of Genesis 7 to Genesis 8, 19. The reason why I'm stopping a couple verses before the end of the chapter is verses 20 and following go straight to the Noahic covenant, which the covenant that God makes with Noah, which is also in chapter 9. So we are, Lord willing, going to stop at chapter 8, verse 19, and cover the rest of the details about the flood. So, in a brief review of what we covered last week, we see God's deliverance of Noah and his family through Noah's obedience in building an ark. We see God giving those on earth 120 years before his plan is determined on judgment. We see life on earth, the sons of God going to the daughters of men and once again disobeying with multiple marriages. And so we see people who knew the truth, who should be following God, turning away from him. We see every intent of the thoughts of man's heart becoming evil continually. We see God's judgment, God's justice in not allowing sin to continue forever, in making an end of sin. And we see the start of the flood, where it has rained 40 days and 40 nights with two other things mentioned, the floodgates of heaven and the fountains of the deep. And 150 days, the waters are prevailing on the earth. Prevailing meaning basically is in that exact sense of overcoming the earth, of being over the earth, of not being diminished. Any questions there in the brief review? We left off, yes?
It did remind me when you said that, they obviously knew, at least had a sense of God in some way, recognized him, even though they didn't follow him, and I thought of Romans 1, when
Yeah.
God was
Yes, and we know at least that Enoch and Noah both preached righteousness, and between the two of their lifespans, that basically would cover the last 700 or 800 years before the flood. And so there was opportunity to find and to know the truth, and men turned against it. This is the point we left off on, which I put as point 2 of the outline now, that the flood is not a local flood. I covered 2 evidences last time, and my mind went blank on the third. I didn't write anything down in my outline up here because as soon as I thought of, okay, how am I going to teach this? My mind immediately thought of 3, and I'm like, okay, I'll be fine. So only 2 of those came to mind last time. But fossilized seashells on the top of Mount Everest and in the Himalayas indicates very strongly the whole world was underwater. The S-folding of rock layers, the evolutionists will tell you that every rock layer represents many thousands of years of geologic history, and that when the conditions on the earth changed, there's a new rock layer laid on top. Rock layers, you can find pictures on canyon walls of 100 or so foot sections that are S-folded, where the rock layers are bent like this and they S-curve. That is not possible if the rock layers were deposited over geologic eras. It must mean the rock layers were soft when they S-folded. And how are the rock layers going to be soft? They must be waterlogged. And you look at where these canyons are and such, you once again get the same picture that the earth was underwater, and that was the time when most of the rock layers we see now, especially sedimentary rock, were deposited. And the third evidence that I immediately thought of, there are 3 forests in the world, which I should call petrified forests, that we know of that have trees fossilized downward through rock layers, meaning the trees are petrified and they're upside down going straight through 6, 7, 8 rock layers. How did that happen? Until the eruption of Mount St. Helens, we didn't know. It was a very good argument against evolutionists that, look, these rock layers obviously aren't geologic eras because you have these trees going upside down through them. Mount St. Helens, the eruption of the mountain blew a couple million trees into Spirit Lake with what happened, a huge pyroclastic flow hitting it. Those trees floated on it and then started petrifying. And when the trees petrify, they become more dense in the water and they sink. They either fall right side up and fall upside down. And we see rock layers being deposited on the bottom of Spirit Lake with trees both right side up and upside down petrified through them. And now we know that's how these petrified forests were deposited. There were trees on the top of the water that petrified and either sank right side up or upside down as the rocks built up, and you have trees fossilized both ways through the rock layers. So, what does that tell you? Areas such as the petrified forest in Arizona need to have been underwater. That petrified forest is a few thousand feet above sea level in the middle of a desert. How did that happen? You get very quickly to there must be a global flood. Yes.
Now, when you said that the trees were floating and they petrified, but don't trees usually, if they're floating, they rot?
So,
Is that what I'm asking?
So the mineral content of Spirit Lake, because of the eruption and otherwise, is so high that the trees do not rot. There aren't bacteria attacking the trees. If you go over there when the roads are repaired, or if you have a very fancy hiking setup, there are still, last I heard, like 1.6 million trees floating on the lake, and those trees are 40 to 50 years old from when they got blasted into the lake. And all the bark, all the branches are gone, but the trunks are still there and not rotted. So, we then have the character of God revealed in chapter 7. This is the last chapter. I'll be having the character of God and the character of man at the end, because find out if I don't get to the end of a study, that's a break in tempo. It's harder to discuss this. What do we see? We see God completely judging sin, and we see nobody able to escape God's judgment. So God's complete judgment on sin, that nobody can escape God's judgment. We see that because of the responsibility and dominion God has given man, that God's judgment affects more than just the people sinning. It affected the whole world, even though it was just the men in the world that were sinning. We also see God's mercy and judgment on Noah and his family. And this is used a couple times in the New Testament as an example that God knows how to deliver the righteous while judging the ungodly and reserving them to the day of judgment. That is what this is showing, that when God judges, he still delivers the righteous. We see the Lord repenting, that is the Lord changing his mind. Not because the Lord was affected by time, but because with the actions of men, the Lord changed his mind about man living on the earth because of man's sin. The two ways we see most often that the Lord changes his mind in Scripture are because of mankind rebelling and sinning against him, or because of mankind repenting when God gives them warning, such as in the example of Nineveh and Jonah. Jonah prophesied 40 days and the city shall be overthrown, and the people repented from the least to the greatest, and God did not carry out the judgment that he promised in 40 days because the people had repented. And God has this one chapter discussion with Noah about why he was absolutely right to have mercy. The Lord's nature is both mercy and judgment, and he will judge sin, and he will be merciful on those who are repentant. Then we have the Lord, we see the Lord grieved, and the implication, although we have seen this with chapter 1, that the Lord saw everything was very good and that it pleased him. But the Lord can be both pleased and grieved by the actions of men. Not that men can hurt or affect the Lord in terms of who the Lord is, but there are times where the Lord is pleased with the actions of men. There are times where the actions of men grieve the Lord. Both of those can happen. Lastly, we see God gave very comprehensive directions to Noah regarding what to do. Everything that Noah needed to prepare the ark for his family's deliverance, God gave him that. And the same is true in the life of a believer, that God gives every direction we need. It's our responsibility that we are close enough to him, that we respond and that we follow him. But God is always faithful to give directions whenever we or any other person needs it. And I'll qualify that with, as far as those in right relationship with him. God does not always give directions to those who are evil and turning away from him when they need it. So we see then the character of man revealed. We see that man is wicked and the intent of his heart is only evil continually, but Noah is an exception. So we see that's generally true of man, the wickedness and their intent of their heart, only evil continually. And we see Noah walked with God, same phrase used as with Enoch, and that he was perfect in his generations, the word perfect meaning blameless. Even with the great evil that Noah lived through, he refused to participate with the rest of the generation in rebelling against God. So, that's the end of covering chapter 7. Let's go to chapter 8 and look at the very first verse to get the purpose of chapter 8 in one sentence. The very first verse of chapter 8 says, "And God remembered Noah and every living thing and all that cattle that was with him in the ark." This is the one sentence purpose of Genesis chapter 8. It's God completing his deliverance of Noah and the rest of life on the earth. And it's God's personal care that Noah and the ark would be safe and the world would be ready to be inhabited again. So we see God remembering Noah and providing for him. We see the end of the flood in Genesis chapter 8. And we see God's command to leave the ark. In the last few verses, we also see the start of the Noahic covenant, which we will cover next time. So I ended my outline with God's command to leave the ark. God remembered Noah. It's the end of the flood now. And God telling Noah what to do as he left the ark. Do I have a volunteer to read verses 1 through 2 of Genesis 8? Verses 1 through 2. Okay, go ahead, Gary.
And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain from heaven was restrained.
So, chapter 8 here, we see not that God ever forgot Noah and every living thing. God remembering is the idea of God's paying special attention to, and God showing his faithfulness to Noah and every living thing. It's not that God forgot, it's that God is showing his faithfulness and his care for Noah and those in the ark. So, what does God do because of that? He brings a wind over the earth. This is probably causing the waters to circulate in a way that I am not going to speculate upon, but so that they would evaporate or dry quicker. We see it mentions the waters assuaged. Assuaged is the opposite of prevailed. That is, they were having victory. They were over the earth now. Now they're assuaging. They're losing. They are going back down after being over the earth for 150 days. We see God stopping the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven, stops each of them. So whatever those sources were that were causing extra water onto the earth, possibly, for instance, the cracks in the ocean trenches that are still there, abyssal plains, the cracks in abyssal plains. But regardless, whatever they were, God has stopped that. And
What was that? You said cracks
in
and
the abyssal plains.
abyssal plains?
The abyssal plains are the lowest parts of the oceans, and there's in each of them a crack that is not a plate boundary in the center with this weird pattern of ridges around it. And there's about 20 of them going different directions in the various oceans. But the question of what they are is not fully certain, but they're throughout the oceans. And if there was any way the water was coming up from the bottom of the oceans, it would be through that type of thing. We then have God restrains the rain. The three things we see here, that God stopped the fountains of the deep with the windows of heaven. He stopped those. So they're no longer adding more water. And then he restrained the rain on the earth, probably so the wind can dry out the earth faster, but God also stops it from raining. That's verses 1 through 2. And the waters now are diminishing from the earth. We have the next section, verses 3 to 14, and I will ask people to read that in two halves. A volunteer to read verses 3 to 9 first. Go ahead, Lorelei. Thank you. Do I have another volunteer to read verses 10 through 14? Verses 10 through 14. Go ahead, Pastor.
And he stayed yet another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came in to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dry.
So, before we get to the timetable of all the days and such, how that works, probably what's happening here, let's talk about what happened in these verses. So, the end of the 150 days, I will give this time, just so you have an idea, that's sometime in the 9th month. So, the end of the 150 days would be sometime in the 9th month. So, verse 4 happens while the waters were abated. The waters are going down, and in verse 4, the ark rested in the 7th month, in the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. The ark is big enough that it gets hung up on these mountains, but the mountains are still not visible. So the ark is not moving now. Normally when ships do this, they get torn to pieces. See here, it's God's providential hand. He wanted the ark to stay in this place, so it gets stuck in the mountains, not damaged, and it's going to stay there for a bunch of months. So the waters decrease continually until the 10th month. So we're about 2.5 months later. First day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Almost certainly we're talking about the tops of the mountains of Ararat. Because if you think of, okay, no matter which one of the possible different mountain ranges of Ararat this would be, these mountains are somewhere around 10,000 feet tall. And there are mountains in the earth that are considerably taller than 10,000 feet nowadays, which means, if you think about it this way from Noah's point of view, he can start to see the tops of the mountains a couple months after the ark got stuck on them. So, into 40 days, Noah opens the window of the ark. Think of a portal, a door for birds. Not he wasn't looking out of the ark before, but now he's going to open that and send a bird out. Yes?
I was just curious, and we may not be able to know this, I'm sure, but what was the water level between, the ark, what was it, 45, 50 feet tall, or was it something like
So,
that? But then I was wondering what the water line was, where the ark, in other words,
how far would the ark go down? My guess is the ark was very low in the water. That it was completely sealed around is my guess, and you have it as low in the water as possible so it's stable. You do not want the ark turning back and forth. The more the ark rocks for months and months, the more miserable every person and thing is going to be on it. But if you have it stable enough, it's not doing very much rocking. So
My thought was,
my guess is most of the ark was underwater. It could be as much as, say, 40 feet underwater. And so the ark does get stuck a couple months before the mountains it got stuck on become visible.
okay, that's what I was, where it hit ground and then how much water had to evaporate.
So he sends a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters are dried up. That didn't make much sense to me when I was younger. Talking to Pastor Oliver, when he explained it, makes complete sense. What do ravens do? They'll eat everything, floating on the water or not. And so the raven is like, oh, this is a feast, never comes back, is just having a happy time out on the water, eating whatever it finds. There's enough place to nest or such because the tops of the mountains are visible. So Noah was like, okay, I need to do something else. So he sends forth a dove. Difference between a dove and a raven: dove is only going to be plant eating and it's going to need a lot more security. And so the dove is not happy to live in the current climate outside and returns right back to him in the ark after finding there isn't any other place that's suitable for a dove. That's verse 9. The dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him into the ark. And he put forth his hand and took her and pulled her into the ark. Sent it out 7 days, and the dove this time comes back with an olive branch, which tells you the trees are already growing, but the dove still doesn't think, the dove would nest in a tree. So the dove could not find something that was big enough, bush, shrub, or otherwise, to nest in. But apparently, trees are growing. Noah knows that things are going well. My guess is the reason why Noah doesn't know personally is, remember, the ark is huge. And the window is probably in the center part at the very top, and you probably can't see down from the window. So that all Noah is seeing is just like sky and maybe parts of water and clouds, and he has no idea what's happening besides the tops of the mountains he can see. No other idea. So he's sending forth the dove to find out what's actually happening. A week later, he sends forth the dove, and the dove doesn't return, meaning the dove found somewhere to build a nest. And we then have the waters were dried from off of the earth, and Noah looked, and the face of the ground was dry in verse 13 of chapter 8. So here, Noah decided he waited long enough, maybe just to make it a special occasion. The very start of the next year is the day he takes the covering, whatever the waterproof covering was that they had on the top of the ark, because the ark got rained on a lot. And so from this verse, there was some type of covering on the top of the ark to protect it from all the rain. And when Noah removes that, he's able to go out on the top of the ark and now look down at the ground for the first time, and he sees this face, the surface of the ground is dry. Not that the earth is completely dry yet, but the surface of the ground is dry, meaning he's also probably seen a lot of plants growing. The earth would be extremely fertilized between the minerals of the water, everything getting tossed around, and all of the dead stuff that the flood took out. It would be the perfect climate for plants to grow with all the water along with all the fertilization. And then we see chapter 8, verse 14, in the second month, in the 7th and 20th day, almost 2 months later, was the earth dried. So now everything around is not just surface level dry, but is dry like normal. So that's the overview. Noah sends out these birds to test it. The raven's happy just flying around and eating things. The dove comes back a couple times until there's a place for the dove to nest, which is how Noah knows now. There's a lot of stuff down where he can't see that isn't just water. He waits till the start of the next year, opens the ark up, finds the surface dry, and is going to wait 2 more months before God tells him to go out, because that's going to be the next verse we read. Go ahead.
Just when it says you remove the covering, I wonder if that was a major, like, we need all my sons, we got to get here, there's some things to remove to get this top off.
I expect so. Like I've thought of it like a hide tent type thing over the top of the ark that's meant to be waterproof. And it would be hundreds of feet long. Like, this thing would be a giant, giant thing. And if anybody's ever worked with any big tents, they're an undertaking anyway if they're made to be taken down quickly. This was made to stay on, not to be taken down quickly. It probably was quite the project to remove the covering. What else? Where is the ark now? You can look online, you'll find all sorts of various conspiracies about where is the ark now. There's a Mount Ararat that is in Iran, which is different from the mountains of Ararat in Turkey. Based on where people started out, where civilization started out, the Iran side is more likely, because that is very, very close to where the first of the human civilizations grew up, which we're going to talk about with the Tower of Babel. But the biggest argument to be made for Turkey that I have heard is there's a zone in the mountains that the Turkish government does not let any people besides the few select government officials go to. Now, something that big, it would last for a couple thousand years with everything treated for waterproofing, especially considering that climate in both cases is semi-desert, but it can be buried. There is no guarantee that it is at all visible. And the other part, God has very specifically designed it so that nobody knows where the ark is. Why? It would be a holy site and would once again distract away worship from God. The same way I think of the bronze serpent of Moses, lasted all the way till Hezekiah, and all it did was distract the people and cause them to commit idolatry rather than worshiping God. God has, however, ordained it that the ark itself is not a monument that people will know. And the Creation Museum part, they very clearly have that ark focused on God. Not as that is a monument, but it's showing how, in that case, the Lord provided. All of that to mention, where is the ark now? We don't know. Almost certainly it's in one of those two places. Whatever ruins are left. I remember seeing one TV show a long time ago where a person held up a wood chip and said, this is a chip of gopher wood from Noah's Ark, and nowadays we don't even know what type of wood that was. The pronunciation in Hebrew is gopher. It has nothing to do with gophers, the animal. But all of that to say, people make a lot of stuff up. Brings us then to the timetable of the flood. So you start, we know that Noah entered the ark on the 17th day of the second month. Almost certainly we're talking about 30-day months. The reason why is a little complicated to get into here, but in general, when the Bible talks about months, it's talking about 30-day months because of various calendars, Hebrew and otherwise. Well, 40 days it was raining. That brings us to the 27th day of the third month. That's all the raining. Then we have 150 days of the waters prevailing, which would be exactly 5 months. That would bring us to the 27th day of the 8th month. Now, it's not that it didn't rain during those 5 months, but it didn't rain all the time, every single day during those 5 months. We know at the end God stopped the rain, so it was still raining on and off. But it was 40 days of straight rain, and then more weather and such as the waters prevailed. So that brings us 27th day of the 8th month. We look, the first day of the 10th month is when the tops of the mountains were seen. With 30-day months, it's 34 days later. 34 days of the waters abating. The tops of the mountains are visible. By this point, the ark is already rested in the mountains of Ararat. It's been rested there for about 2 months. 34 days after the waters abated, the tops of the mountains are visible. We then see Noah waiting 40 days before he starts sending out birds. So we're talking about the 11th day of the 11th month is when Noah starts sending out birds. He sends out a raven and a dove immediately, then waits 7 days to send out a dove and waits 7 more days to send out the dove again. So that's a total of 2 weeks. We're talking about the 25th day of the 11th month is when he sends out the dove that doesn't return. For whatever reason, Noah waits until the beginning of the next year to remove the covering from the ark and look. Well, that was 37 days. Noah waits 37 days from 25th of the month to the first day of the first month. Once again, this is assuming 30-day months. And then there are 57 days between when he found the surface of the ground dry, and God told Noah to leave the ark on the 27th day of the second month. Now it is interesting, if you add all the days and all the periods together, 40, 150, 27, 40, 14, 37, and 57, the total is exactly 365. The total, assuming 30-day months, Noah was in the ark for exactly 365 days. Now, if the months have a different count of days, the answer would be slightly different. Regardless, it's clear that Noah and his family were in the ark for basically exactly a year, sometime extremely close to a year. With 30-day months, it's exactly a year. So, now God commands Noah with what to do in the future. Do I have a volunteer to read verses 15 to 17? Yes.
Before you do that, a question from verse 13
Yes.
is a reference to the 601st year.
Very good question. Noah is 601. The flood starts at the 600th year of Noah's life, and it actually says back a chapter ago that was the 600th year of Noah's life. Now he's 601. It's the 601st year, and that's where the flood is drying. So it's referencing how old Noah was. So I'll get you the exact verse from chapter 7. Chapter 7, verse 6. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. And so now he's 601.
I'm sorry, what reference is it?
Genesis 7, verse 6. So, very good question. Any volunteer now to read verses 15 to 19? Yes.
When removing the covering, there's nothing in the building of the ark that mentions the covering, correct?
That is true.
So it wouldn't be, I guess I had a thought of the top part of the ark, and maybe that whole thing was, but that wouldn't be a covering per se.
Yeah, if they entered through the top, then there's an argument that they're talking about the covering of whatever they used to keep that entry safe. It seems that the reading of it, though, that the entry was in the side because of the words that God uses to describe it. But all that to say, I did not look up what the word covering is actually referring to. I will look it up in the Hebrew and come back with if that indicates what material it's made of. So that brings us back to verses 15 to 17. A volunteer to read those verses. Go ahead, Gary.
And God spake unto Noah, saying, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons wives with thee. Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee, of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth.
So, Noah's had a huge exercise in patience for an entire year waiting. And if we think about it, for about the last 5 months, it hasn't rained. So it's been 5 months of just everything drying up. And now God tells Noah at the perfect time what he needs to do after he's been waiting for a year. Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. So he tells them to leave and to bring all the living creatures out too in verse 17. Bring every living thing. Now once again we have a statement of what's in the ark. Carries every living bird, besides the dove and raven that have already been sent out. Carries the cattle and the creeping things that creepeth upon the earth. We're talking insects, reptiles, worms, that kind of thing. Bring that out. And so God gives basically very, very, very little detail here because Noah doesn't need to know the details. Just get out, the time is right, and take all the life with you. So he does. That's verses 18 and 19. And Noah went forth, and his sons, and his wife, and his son's wife with him, every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth after their kinds went forth out of the ark. So God told Noah, all those living things leave. Noah obeys God once again. The passage on the flood starts with Noah's obedience. When God tells him that the flood is coming, Noah doesn't, as far as we have record of, question God at all. He's been walking with God up to this point. He takes God at his word. He builds this entire ark. God helps provide the animals, but then Noah does his part. All the animals are brought in. And now, once again, when God tells him what to do, there is no questioning. No, are you sure it's the right time? He directly obeys God, takes all the animals out, and goes out himself. And the first thing he's going to do is build an altar for the Lord for sacrifice, which brings us to, I guess, next lesson. Any questions here about this chapter or any of the details? So, I will then spend 5 minutes talking about changes to the earth, which is not biblical, but which can be deduced from, I'll say, looking at what has happened to various areas of the earth. The earth before was tropical everywhere. I should say semi-tropical everywhere, not jungle. We're talking, say, Mediterranean climate. How do we know this? It was watered by a mist. That would mean extremely high humidity as well as decently high temperature. How do we know it was the whole earth? Frozen palm trees are under the ice in Antarctica. It's one of the most inexplicable things to an evolutionist, seeing that, because even in their conception of Pangea, that all the continents were together at one time, Antarctica would never be in any place at all that would ever have palm trees. So,
What did you said Pangea?
Pangea, that every continent of the earth was all together in one clump and has slowly spread out through the oceans spreading and plates moving and such. But all that to say, that's something. Now we see there are seasons. And in fact, at the very last verse of this chapter, God is going to promise that summer and winter will not cease. We see seasons marked before. If the earth was semi-tropical, we're talking wetter and drier, not hotter and colder and hotter and colder. Now God actually mentions summer and winter at the end of this chapter. There's a temperature variation in seasons. There's a huge variation in temperature across the earth. We know from, we can see glacier marks in plains that go as far down as Kansas. That is, that entire area, either during the flood, as things were drying, or right afterward, freezes so dramatically that it's putting glaciers down in Kansas. And from that part all the way up to the Canadian Shield and the Hudson Bay, it's just glacier scored rock all the way up. You go through the soil, get to the rocks, and you see scores in the rocks where we know that type of score is caused when glaciers have pebbles underneath, and the ice slides and crushes the pebble into the rock and makes these gigantic, like inches long troughs in the rock. So the northern hemisphere was very much frozen, which means probably things were cooler in the area that's now extremely hot desert. The first people either settled in Turkey, semi-desert, or in Iran, one of the hottest places in the earth. Well, it wouldn't have been that hot then. We know from the book of Job, the oldest written book, that Job lived in the area that is now Arabia, and it was green. And Job talks about that, all the plant and animal life, and he's a very, very successful rancher in what is now the Arabian desert, and one of the hardest areas to farm in. There was a huge temperature change. The areas in the center of the earth were much greener, and the areas towards the poles were much colder. Yes?
Can you explain, so more or less you're talking about the Ice Age, what we would...
Yeah. What the evolutionists calls the Ice Age immediately, that they think lasted for a couple 100,000 years. To the creationist, lasted for much less time. How much less? There's a person named as Peleg in the Bible because during his days the earth was divided. There's two possibilities for what that division is. One is that was when God divided the languages of the Tower of Babel. The second is when the earth was actually split up. We know from studying people migration, this is an area I've actually already taught on for the 6th grade, a lot of people actually moved over from Russia all the way to the Americas, such as the Eskimos and the Inuits. And there are other nationalities that didn't move over and probably came over by ship. So, well, how could they move over from Russia to what is now Alaska and Canada? If you look at the Bering Strait between them, it's about 130 feet deep. If the waters on the Earth, there was enough ice on the Earth that there was 130-foot lower ocean level, you could walk across. And we're not talking of barren land. We're talking of land that close to the coast would be very livable and such. So we have people migrations. I asked Pastor Oliver, because I believe this is true, and I asked him one of the difficult parts. The trench between Madagascar and the rest of Alaska is like 4,000 feet deep. I was like, how did the life get to Madagascar? Because there is no way that the oceans were ever that low to let. And he's like, well, people, we know they traveled over by ship. And when you look at all the native life there, it's plants that reproduce by cuttings floating over, and it's animals that could float on pieces of trees or such, floating over to Madagascar. There are no large animals and no large wildlife on the entire country of Madagascar. It's jungle, but it doesn't have the lions and jaguars and such. Well, that would be a very strong evidence that a life spread down to Africa normally, and only the stuff that came across, accident, disaster, whatever, just like to ride branches of trees, is the life that's currently in Madagascar.
So as far as the frozen part, so how in a nutshell, how do you explain, okay, after the flood, that all of a sudden this upper echelon was all frozen?
Why things are so frozen? Water evaporating cools. If you have ever, say, put water in your hand and waited back and forth, you know that water evaporating cools, and it's actually a huge, huge cooling. The evaporation of water, which the cooling effect is called the latent heat of fusion of water. It would be the latent heat of condensation, because we're not talking about the water becoming ice, that's fusion. We're talking about the water going from gas to liquid, is extremely high. The latent heat of water is like 5 or 6 times that of most liquid chemicals. The reason for, I can talk to you if you want a chemistry lesson, but all that to mention. All this water evaporating, drying, however, as the water moves, it causes a tremendous cooling effect. And, well, if this cooling effect is dropping everything down to near freezing, what's the water going to do? It's going to freeze as ice the next time there's precipitation, and that causes a warming effect. You don't think about it, but when water freezes, that takes a lot of the cold, low energy, and the temperature will actually go up as the water is freezing there. So it's like basically the Earth's moderating temperature. God has designed the Earth so that nothing goes out of control, that everything is stable, that if an equilibrium happens one way, something moves it, the Earth is still fine. If things go the other way, I very, very strongly believe local warming is true, global warming is an absolute lie, and regardless, there is nothing that will ever happen to this Earth that will hamper or destroy livability until the tribulation. The Earth will be fine. God's designed so many counteracting things that I would love to spend hours talking about that I'm not going to. But all that to say, that's the immediate answer. All the water going off the Earth, evaporating, cooling, there's been a wind going on the Earth that God has created. That causes a cooling effect, and a very strong cooling effect. So, that brings us to the end. What do we see? We see God's perfect design for the end of the flood, telling Noah exactly when to leave. We see God protecting and preserving Noah and his whole family in the ark, that it got stuck on mountains and stayed there for basically a month and a half, and it wasn't damaged, destroyed, or otherwise broken. They could still live in that ark for the last 3 months before God told them to go out. And we see the judgment is complete. Remember, in the biblical side, Old Testament, plants are never called by the Lord as alive. And when God says all life on the earth was destroyed except for that which Noah and the ark, it's because those are the only animals and only things that are living, not sea creature related. And that's a good spot of any to end. Let's close in prayer.